Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar presentation titled New Visa Legislation for Registered Nurses, Understanding the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, and more. My name is Ron Hoppe. I'm the CEO of Worldwide Health Staff Solutions, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by a great friend and colleague, Chris Musillo, who will introduce more fully in just a moment. Again, welcome to everyone that is joining us for this presentation today. Just a couple of things before we jump into our topic for today. I do apologize for not being on camera. We're having some technical difficulties here, but the main thing is we're able to see Chris's smiling face, so that's most important. As we get set to begin, as we always do, I would ask that you take a moment and in the chat section of your screen, just drop us a note letting us know what country that you're joining us from today. It's always very interesting for us to see the many different countries represented on these presentations, and it also allows us to ensure that we're tailoring and focusing our content in future presentations in a most appropriate way. So please take a moment and just drop a note in the chat section of your screen letting us know where you're joining us from. As we go through our presentation today, I would also ask that you share any questions that you may have also in the chat section of your screen. And we're going to do our very best after our presentation to respond to as many of your questions as we can. In saying that, I would also just mention that this is not a forum in which we are able to respond to case-specific inquiries. We can respond in a general way. Excuse me. We can respond to some things in a general way, and we can certainly respond to the specific subject matter that we're going to be covering today in any level of detail that may be appropriate. But please do share your questions. We welcome them, and we will do our very best to respond to those as we go along. So as we get ready to jump into our presentation today, new visa legislation for registered nurses, if we could go to the next slide, please. It's my great pleasure to introduce to all of you Chris Musillo. Chris and myself have worked together for many years. Probably Chris at this point more than we're willing to admit to. But Chris is one of the leading healthcare immigration attorneys in the United States. Chris has been and continues to be very, very deeply involved in various government advocacy issues, working on legislative and regulatory reforms. So Chris is probably the foremost authority to help cover the topic that we have today. So Chris, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Ron, good morning. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thanks for that very nice introduction. And pleased to discuss healthcare immigration with the group this morning.
Yeah, I know in the healthcare immigration field, Chris, I'm sure it's very boring and there's not much going on these days. Just joking, of course, but
yeah, no, no, yeah, it has been, it's always been an exciting space. I've been doing this for since the 1990s, since the late 1990s. You and I, Ron, have known each other for probably 20, 25 years or something.
Yeah.
So we go back quite a bit, and I have to tell you, the last 6-9 months, really, the new Trump administration has probably been a crazier, time than I can remember any other year in the long time you and I have been doing this.
Yeah, good. Well, here we are. So let's try and bring some clarity to our guests, just kind of where we're at and where we think we might be headed. So if we go to the next slide, please. I think, Chris, it would be helpful if we take just a moment and just to sort of ground everyone with a quick history of the green card program for RNs. And if you could maybe just kind of walk through how that program has worked historically and kind of bring us up to the current date, I think that'd be a good foundation as we move forward to current state.
Yeah, so the modern U.S. employment-based green card program has existed for about 35 years. And it's important to know up at the top that we are talking about green cards, which is the colloquial term for permanent resident, or actually the other technical term is called immigrant, as opposed to non-immigrant, which are temporary workers. So we're going to be talking again about green cards, legal permanent residents, immigrants. All three of those terms are identical. The program works like this. The U.S. government allocates 140,000 employment-based immigrant visas, employment-based green cards per year, every year. And if those green cards are not fully used, meaning the U.S. government does not issue 140,000 green cards in a year, those visas essentially disappear. So it's a use it or lose it program. Now, those 140,000 green cards, a couple of important things. First, there are 5 tiers of potential green cards. So there's employment-based green card pathway number 1, or what we often call EB1. And there is employment-based pathway 2, EB2, and so on down to EB3, EB4, and EB5. And the 140,000 are split amongst those. It doesn't really matter how they're split up. We could go through it. I'm not sure it's helpful for the audience. But it's also important to know that no one country, that there are other green card categories. There's mainly family-based is the other big category. Those are marriages and children of U.S. citizens and of legal permanent residents. They have a bigger pool. It's 260,000, I think. Altogether, if you put all those together, no one country is allowed to use more than 7%, although they're like with a lot of this stuff, there's some exemptions and exceptions. You put all of that together, and every month we come out with a visa bulletin, and the visa bulletin will tell us at what date a green card can move forward to the final step. And the final step in the employment-based pathway is an interview. And if that interview happens overseas, we call that a consular process case. That can happen at a consulate, embassy, anywhere around the world. And if the interview happens in the United States, we call that an adjustment of status. But ultimately, it's the exact same thing. It's an interview with a U.S. immigration official. The bad news is that 140,000 cap, and indeed that 7% per country cap, that has not changed in my lifetime, basically. So it would be nice in a world where the U.S. population continues to grow if they would index the growth of employment-based immigrant visas alongside that population growth.
Yeah. So I think in summary, as it says on the slide here, it's the good news is, right, it's a well-established program. I think the outcomes are fairly predictable, even if the timing is not, right? And the not so good news is we're dealing with a program that hasn't changed in a long time. And in the meantime, the country, the workforce, many other things have changed. Next slide, please. So that's the history of green cards, Chris. I know maybe in the last 2 years or so, there's also been increased discussion and increased focus around H-1B visas for nurses. And if you could just take a moment and just talk to our guests about how H-1B visas for nurses were viewed historically, kind of how that might have changed here in the last 18 or 24 months. And I know later on in our presentation, we'll talk about some of the more recent developments with H-1B. But again, just to help set the stage, if you could just share a little bit of a historical perspective on H-1Bs and registered nurses.
Sure. Yeah. So H-1Bs for registered nurses. The H-1B process, like a lot of U.S. immigration processes, this again is a temporary non-immigrant visa. So compare that with the green card permanent residency. The temporary visa is valid for 1 to 3 years in the initial granting of the H-1B visa. It can be extended up to 6 years, and in many instances, it can be extended beyond 6 years. It can also happen generally fairly quickly. There's an H-1B lottery every March. And so if you register your case in March, you find out by April whether or not you've been selected, because there are always more Bs subscribed than are selected. And then you can enter the United States in October. So that's fairly quick. Register March, file your case in April, start in October. And then there's even another whole class of healthcare organizations, which if they are universities or affiliated with universities, they often can register and file their cases year round. So there's a lot to like about the H-1B program, which of course begs the question, what's the downside? And as you note on the slide, historically, there has been minimal use of the H-1B for RNs. And here's why. There's two broad ideas behind an H-1B. One, does the worker themselves hold a bachelor's degree? If we're talking about nursing, do they hold a BSN, a bachelor's of science in nursing? And the reality is, for most of our international people that we work with, and I know your organization works with, Ron, our vast experience is that the vast majority of these folks do actually hold the BSN. So that isn't the challenge. The challenge is the second half. The second half is that the U.S. employer must require a bachelor's degree for entry into that specific position. And in the United States, historically, the standard for entry into the nursing profession is actually a 2 or 3 year collegiate degree, what we here call an associate's degree or a diploma nurse degree. And so a lot of Americans enter the nursing workforce not with a 4-year BSN, but with a 2 or 3 year associate or diploma degree. As a result of that, the USCIS, going back really as long as I've been doing this, but most notably in guidance memoranda in 2004 and in 2016 or 17, came out with guidance that said that ordinarily nurse positions in the United States do not require a bachelor's degree, and therefore they are ineligible for the H-1B. So that's been the history. What has happened in the recent past is, in the last few years, we've seen a couple of things emerge in the U.S. Workforce. First, nursing in the United States has now ticked over 70%, and it's even approaching 75%, meaning that the U.S. nurse population, almost 3 in 4 nurses in the United States actually hold a bachelor's degree, which means that we are seeing an elevating education standard in the United States. Now, that's not 100%, but it's certainly trending towards more and more. And the law doesn't say that 100% of the positions, but the trend certainly cuts in favor of bachelor's degree of science nursing. We are also seeing throughout health systems and other nurse employers, more and more entities segment out parts of their workforce where the hospital doesn't just prefer the bachelor's degree, but is now requiring it. So we're seeing it in things like training and precepting, nurse management, float pool positions. We're seeing the BSN required. And so what's actually happening on the ground here, independent of the H-1B rules, is that a lot of these health systems actually have portions of their workforce, units, if you will, where they are requiring bachelor's degrees. And so what that allows some of those health systems is, if they have shortages, not in their overall nursing pool, but in those certain departments and units, to actually hire overseas international RN for those positions, Why? Because the nursing shortage is just so dire in the United States that these health systems, they can't fill virtually any of these positions, including some of these slightly higher level positions. So that's been the state for about 2 or so years. That we at our office have seen more and more of these health systems saying, no. We have these segmented areas where we require bachelor's degrees. However, in the last about 30 days, we've seen President Trump come out with a presidential proclamation. And that proclamation says each and every H-1B now gets $100,000 tax on top of the usual filing fees, which already are in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. And so that $100,000 filing fee makes it, frankly, nearly impossible for any health system or U.S. employer to file H-1Bs. Now, the $100,000 fee that we've seen, that's been around for about 3 weeks, the proclamation talks entirely about the information technology industry, and it spends a lot of the proclamation talking about perceived abuses in the information technology industry, mainly around this idea of U.S. employers firing American workers in IT and then backfilling and hiring international H-1B workers to backfill those positions. I've seen reporting both ways on this. I've seen some folks say that this is a great problem in IT. I've seen other folks say that a lot of this is really overblown. And yes, maybe it's happened a couple of times, but it is really being overexposed. Regardless, none of that is true, Ron, in the healthcare space. There's no U.S. nurses who are being fired and then backfilled by international nurses.
Right.
In our industry, Ron, and you know this is a situation of international nurses filling spots where there are true open positions. And in many instances, these are healthcare systems who would like to open maybe rural clinics, maybe expand their hospitals so they can expand their healthcare offering for their patients. And they're just unable to do that because the U.S. nursing shortage is just so bad. We've got a nursing shortage in this country that's between 200 and 250,000. And many estimates say that by the end of the decade, that's going to grow. That's going to double to about 500,000. So in a world where we've got these great nursing shortages, we're seeing nursing shortages throughout the entire healthcare workforce space.
Yeah. All right. Very good, Chris. Thanks for that overview of H-1B. And just as it appeared that H-1B perhaps was gaining a little bit of momentum as an option for nurses, these most recent developments have just absolutely slammed the brakes on that. And as always, particularly as it relates to H-1B, just a word of caution to any candidate that's looking at pursuing this opportunity for themselves. Make sure that you're well informed, fully informed, understanding the current state of what the opportunities and the challenges are related specifically to H-1Bs. Well, good. So with this background and this perspective, I'd like to go to the next slide. And Chris, there's a number of pieces of legislation hanging out there that have been introduced. We're going to focus on one here in a minute, the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. But just in case somebody's doing some Googling or some searching online, they might come across a couple of others that are out there. If you could just briefly speak to what we have on the screen here, the Safe Healthcare Workers Act and the Healthcare Workforce Innovation Act.
Right. So the Safe Healthcare Workers Act is a bill that reflects, frankly, the U.S. nursing shortage. We have a situation in the United States where there are more nurses retiring than there are coming online. We have a growing and a graying U.S. population that is beginning to demand more and more nursing services. And so these are the things that are creating this nursing shortage that we have in the United States. As a result of this nursing shortage, we have seen a really terrible phenomenon that really springs over the last about 5 or 6 years since the COVID pandemic started, which is there are more and more reports of nurses being harassed, abused, and in some cases even physically assaulted at the work site when they were trying to help U.S. patients. And so the Save Healthcare Workers Act seeks to protect nurses in that area, and so that'd be an excellent bill. It wouldn't impact immigration, but it would be an excellent bill. Similarly, the Healthcare Workforce Innovation Act, again, is really ultimately is because of the U.S. nursing shortage. We have full enrollment at the educational level, which means every seat in an American nursing school every year is basically filled. There are not enough educational opportunities for young American kids who would like to get into nursing. And again, this is because of the nursing shortage. What traditionally used to happen is any year in a cohort of graduates, a certain segment of those graduates would go ahead and get graduate degrees, and then eventually move on into nurse education. They would become teachers for the next generation of American nurses. What has happened in the recent past is because the U.S. nursing shortage is so bad that health systems are so desperate and have raised salaries at such a dramatic level that those people who might ordinarily be inclined to go into education are instead being offered such great employment opportunities in health systems that they're going down that path, which is tamping down the number of U.S. nurse educators, which is why we have a problem growing more American nurses here. And that's a long way of saying that the Healthcare Workforce Innovation Act looks to expand investments so that educational opportunities can increase for young American kids.
Yeah, good. And that brings us to the focus of our presentation today, the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, which is intended to make additional visas available for international clinicians. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And Chris, I know you've done over, 5 years or more extensive work on the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. It's been brought forward a couple of different iterations. It's been introduced in the current Congress again. So maybe just take a few minutes and just kind of walk us through maybe briefly where the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act has been in the past, and more importantly, kind of where it's at today. And then we'll get into a discussion around why the current proposed legislation matters.
Absolutely right. So this bill, the HWRA, has been in Congress. I think this is the third. It might even be the fourth time. I think it's the third. In any event, and the bill has largely stayed the same. Just a real primer, which is that bills, when they're used, they have at most a 2-year lifespan. So there is the 21-22 lifespan, the 2023-24 lifespan, and now we're in the 25-26 lifespan, which means if the bill does not get passed into law by the end of that 2-year period, it expires and you have to start over. And so this bill, like frankly 99% of all bills that are offered into Congress, just expired. It never got passed into law. And there's a whole slew of procedural reasons why that might be the case. I don't think it actually speaks to the credibility of the bill. It probably speaks to just how difficult it is to get anything passed in Congress. It has, however, again, been reintroduced about a month ago into the U.S. Congress, both into the Senate, which is the upper house, and to the House, which is the House of Representatives, which is the lower house of Congress. Senators Durbin, who's a Democrat, have introduced it, along with Senator Kramer, who's a Republican. And that's very important in something as controversial as healthcare and something as controversial as immigration. It's really important to have bipartisan support. We have two primary parties, political parties in America, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the party that President Trump runs, and the Democratic Party is the out of office party, but it was the party of President Biden and President Obama. And the country, in spite of all the rhetoric, is largely a 50-50 country, and therefore it's really important to have both Republicans and Democrats on the bill. So this bill has been introduced about a month ago. We have bipartisan support. Last I looked, we had, I believe it was 12 senators already who've originally co-sponsored the bill or come on board shortly thereafter, which means that they are saying if this bill comes up for a vote, my intention is to vote for the bill. And so that's 12 out of a possible of 100. Last term, we got 20 U.S. senators, 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats. So it's vitally important that we keep that ratio. And so that's the process of the bill. Here's what the bill does, which is maybe more important. The bill recaptures 25,000 visas for nurses and 15,000 visas for doctors for a total of 40,000 visas. It's a one-time shot. My guess is that that visa allocation would last a few years, 1, 2, 3 years, depends just on how quickly they are used. And it would essentially eliminate retrogression for doctors and nurses until the 15,000th doctor visa was issued and the 25,000th nursing visa was issued. It doesn't actually raise green card quotas as a technical matter, because what it is doing is recapturing unused visas from years past. If the viewers recall earlier in the conversation today, we talked about how there's 140,000 employment-based visas per year, and if they are not used, they evaporate, they go unused. And so over the course of many years, there are several 100,000 visas that were authorized but unused. And so what this bill essentially does is it says, let's take 40,000 of those authorized but unused visas from the past. Those people technically should be here if the bureaucracy were working efficiently. And so we're not actually raising the green card quota, but we are recapturing visas that should have been used in the past. So that's sort of the technical way it gets done. But again, the key thing I think for the viewers, 25,000 visas for nurses, 15,000 visas for doctors. That would mean a 1, 2, 3 year elimination of retrogression in the occupational categories.
Okay, great. If we could go to the next slide, Chris, and let's talk a little bit about what the intended impact would be. You've already talked about, knocking down or knocking out retrogression for a period of time. What's interesting to me about the 25,000 potential visas for nurses that's different from the existing EB3 program is that those 25,000 visas would be counted differently than they currently are, right? You would think that counting was a pretty standardized procedure in our society these days, but there's different ways of counting visas. So maybe just elaborate a little bit on how visas would be counted here in the HWRA scenario and how that could be helpful.
Yes, so the counting pieces, we talked earlier about EB 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Essentially, this bill would create an EB6, or what they would probably call an EBA for Schedule A, maybe, I'm not sure, or maybe an EBRN and an EBMD. We actually saw this back when I was considerably younger in my career. This law actually was proposed and signed into law way back in 2005. And that at that time, the Visa Bulletin, since it was actually signed into law, it was very similar. The numbers were slightly different, but to some degree, it doesn't matter too much. But about 20 years ago, it was signed into law, and there was a allotment of visas that were used by the nursing field, and that was great. It lasted, I guess, about 2 years, and so that's what happened. The counting piece is interesting because it depends on whether you count the nurse or the nurse themselves, the doctor themselves, or their dependents, spouses, and kids. This bill would tack on the spouses and kids numbers, and that's where the counting gets a little difficult. And since we don't know how many spouses and children will be added, they're not included in the quota, but they would be able to get their visas at the same time. This will reduce visa processing times. Right now, we have an EB3 retrogression for all countries except for native-born Indians and native-born Chinese of about 2.5 years. The current EB3 retrogression date is April of 23, so that's about 2.5 years ago. This would make everything current. Now, I do not think that would immediately mean everybody would get visa interviews. The reality is an increase of visa quotas so quickly. It would probably take the U.S. embassies and consulates maybe as much as a year to sort of work through the big retrogressed backlog of RNs. And that's just because they only have so many officers at the various embassies and consulates. But that would still, but everybody would be current, and that would be a very welcome situation. In terms of increasing the number of RNs able in the United States, it would, again, over, let's call it 2 years, increase the U.S. nursing workforce by 25,000. But I'm not sure that that's that material a difference, because right now we have a shortage of between 200 and 250,000 nursing positions. That number is growing. And putting 25,000 visas in, that's only something like 10% of the nursing shortage. So,
Right.
On the other hand, for certain types of facilities, rural hospitals and healthcare facilities in particular, this is critical, because it's those facilities that are struggling the hardest to keep their U.S. nurses. And so for those entities, this is essential to their continued ability to serve U.S. patients. And so, what this does, this is not a solution to the U.S. nursing shortage. The shortage is much deeper, but it will help in certain areas and in with certain facilities to mitigate their shortages.
Sure. And it'll also be, I would think, a huge relief to those nurses that are more at the front end of their immigration journey to the U.S. in giving them some assurance that there is a reasonable timeline ahead for them. If we can go to the next slide, please. We've talked a little bit about what the HWRA is looking to accomplish, why it matters. Let's talk about that. Why does this matter? Chris, you've touched on the shortage. The shortage is real, but maybe just let's just review this a little bit further. Why the HWRA matters?
Yeah. So right now, Ron, if a health system, let's pretend you and I are working on with a health system. The health system comes and says we need 25 nurses, and then Ron, you go out and you identify 25 great nurses for the position, and the nurses have all passed the U.S. NCLEX examination. They are maybe they've passed the English fluency exam. They've had their education deemed equivalent to a U.S. School. We've verified that their overseas nursing license is clean. There's no black marks on their overseas nursing license, and so they have passed an English fluency test. So they've met all of these standards. And so one would think, if they weren't familiar with this industry, that we could go ahead and bring those nurses and get them visas and have them in here in a few months. And by the way, one thing I've forgotten to say is that the local American nurses have been notified that these nurses are going to come, the 25 nurses under my example. And indeed, the health system has guaranteed that the importation of the foreign nurses is not going to impact U.S. salaries at all. And indeed, the international nurses are going to be paid the same rates as the American nurses. If all that's true, you would think under the right system that these nurses could immediately come to the United States in just a few months, however long it takes for the background checks to happen at the embassies. But that, of course, is not the case. Instead, there is about a 2.5-year processing time, which means even if all that were true and we filed those cases on behalf of Worldwide Health staff and the employer here in October of 2025, we would not expect those nurses to come to the United States until something like the spring of 2028, 2.5 years from now. This bill, if it were to get passed, would mean that those nurses should be able to come to the United States in under a year, with the only real delay being just that there is such a backlog of nurses that it may take a few months, maybe as much as a year, hopefully not that long, for the embassies to have enough staff to process these cases. It's also quite important for U.S. patients, which is that we are seeing rural health facilities in the United States be unable to expand their offerings for their local patient population. So I was just talking with a rural health employer maybe 30 days ago, maybe less, and they recently closed their rural neonatal unit now, and so now new mothers who were in that rural county actually have to drive about an hour to have healthcare delivered to them and their newborn children, which is just not really the way it should work in a country like America. So this accessibility issue for U.S. patients is huge. We talked a little about the domestic workforce burnout when we were talking about the SAVE Act a little earlier on the slide. And then I think the last piece of this, why the HWRA matters, and you touched on this at the last slide, Ron, is other Western countries, the Western Europes and Australia, Gulf countries, for instance, these countries all have a similar demographical problem that we have in the United States. And I think it's critically important for America to say to international nurses, we want you, we need your talents, we would love to have you, because other countries are doing that. My experience is still most of the international nurses would prefer to come to America over other countries, but I think that will only remain the case is if we have a clean, effective pathway to allow these nurses to come into the United States.
Yeah, Chris, that is a super excellent point. In fact, I was on a meeting earlier today where we were talking with the international head of talent acquisition for one of our U.S. Clients, and they're very interested in seeking our assistance in helping them staff their operations in countries outside of the United States. And I think your point about the U.S. being the preferred destination for the vast majority of migration-minded international nurses is true, but it's not the only option. And increasingly, there's many more options, right, that offer maybe not all of the benefits of living and working in the U.S., but offer some or many of those benefits and have processes that are more streamlined and more timely for them to be able to make that relocation to someplace in Western Europe or in the Middle East, etc. So the international workforce really is a global workforce, and I think it's important that we have that perspective and not just assume that, well, there's all these nurses out there, and whenever we want them, we can just assume they're going to be arriving here soon. So some great points. The HWRA, I think, in the current environment matters very much. I don't know that there will be any clarification or certainty around the H-1B program anytime soon. Chris, I know you've got a big crystal ball there sitting on the corner of your desk. What are your thoughts about, what the conversation might be about H-1B for nurses 3 months or 6 months from now?
Yeah, so I think it's going to break in. I think it's going to break in one of two ways, which is so we have this $100,000 tax on the H-1Bs, and I do think that there will either be an official carve out for nurses, meaning that the nursing cases will not be subject to that $100,000 fee, and I would say that it will either happen formally or informally. And what I mean by that is there might be a formal guidance memorandum issued by USCIS, which says, nursing is such a shortage position. There's no negative impact on U.S. labor. And therefore, we're going to allow nursing and maybe even more broadly healthcare to be exempt from that fee. That would be nice. I think informally it might happen, which is the presidential proclamation does talk about exempting occupations that are in the national interest. And nursing would seem to be fit squarely in that. And so I think we will, if we don't see the first, which is a formal designation, we will see an informal designation, which is health systems will apply and the U.S. government will actually just approve these cases without the 100,000. I also note that there was a lawsuit filed a week or 10 days ago. I have certainly heard that there will be other lawsuits filed in this area. I'm not a litigator. I'm an immigration attorney, but at least on its face, these lawsuits seem to have a lot of merit, that maybe the executive branch overstepped its authority in at least the way they've applied some of this. So I do think down the road later this year, we will see, I think it's more likely than not that we will see the $100,000 fee does not ultimately apply to nursing and healthcare. I think that's more likely than not. With respect to the HWRA, I do think that we will see action on this bill this year, but that doesn't mean it will necessarily pass. But I think if the HWRA is going to move forward, I think it's likely that it would have to happen before the end of the year. So in the next 75 or so days, next year becomes very difficult for a bill like the HWRA to pass. We have a 2-year election cycle, 4-year presidential election cycle, 2-year congressional election cycle. And in any of those 2-year election cycles, my experience is that it's very difficult to get legislation passed.
Right.
Because you're close to the voting, the election point. So my guess is if the HWRA does move forward and gets signed into law, it will happen in the next 75 days. That's not a prediction that will happen, just a prediction that if it is to happen, it will happen in the next 75 days.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Chris, for those insights. Some reason for optimism. Optimism springs eternal. The nursing shortage is here. It's not going away. It's becoming a greater and greater challenge. And as you've referenced a couple of times, increasingly, it's becoming a rural healthcare issue. And I think it's not just a question of rural providers expanding programs. It's just rural providers trying to survive with just maintaining programs that they currently have. So with that, I'm going to invite my colleague, Allie, to join us and to walk us through any questions that may have come in. So Allie, have we got any questions?
Hi, Ron. Yes, thank you. We do have a question. Does the new legislation address other healthcare professionals, such as medical laboratory scientists?
That's a great question, Chris.
Yeah, it is an excellent question, and the answer is unfortunately it doesn't. The HWRA is only about doctors and nurses. The sponsors of the bill have decided that those occupations are the most short. There is, of course, a medical lab technologist, medical lab scientist shortage in the United States. Those cases are still viable through the H-1B, assuming we can get this $100,000 thing cleaned up.
Okay. And then our next question is, how will I know if I qualify under the HWRA?
It's not about you qualifying. It's about the employer having a position that requires a bachelor's degree. And so the best thing you can do is you can ask. Candidly, there's not that many positions in the United States that require a bachelor's degree, although that number is growing. So it is difficult to find an H-1B subject job.
Yeah.
And then we do have some questions about the November visa bulletin. Any kind of predictions on when that may be posted?
Chris, back to the crystal ball.
Right. My prediction is it will be published this week. I am not expecting a dramatic change in the dates. Could they move up a week or two? Sure, I guess that's possible. But I think anyone expecting more than that is probably going to be disappointed. Week or two, if it moved even as much as a month, I guess that wouldn't be that surprising, but that's not what I'm predicting. I would predict it's basically going to stay the same, maybe move up a week or two.
Okay. And then any questions that are case specific, please reach out to your case manager or recruiter. They'll be able to answer those. I haven't seen any other questions come through about this topic.
Okay. Good. Well, Emily, thanks for that. And Chris, thank you again for taking time out of your day to share this very valuable information with our guests. We'll certainly continue to monitor not only the HWRA and the latest H-1B developments closely, but we'll, as always, commit to keeping the applicant community and even our clients fully apprised of any developments that come up in this regard. We're very optimistic that we'll see some positive developments here on one or both of those topics here as we head into the latter part of 2025. As always, I would just briefly remind you of our Refer a Nurse program. It has become wildly popular around the world with literally thousands of referrals being received and being paid out. So just some information here on that. We welcome your follow-up questions. As Ali has said, if you're an existing applicant, please continue to work closely with your case manager. Also, feel free to reach out to Chris if you have any sort of general type of immigration-related question. Chris, just as we wrap up today, just any closing thoughts or comments that you would share?
Yeah, so I guess the most important two things I'd like to share, Ron, is number one is this 2.5-year retrogression for EB3, I'm sure is difficult for a lot of people who are on this webinar. I can tell you historically, it's actually not that unusual, and it does move faster than you think. That's number one. Number two, I know there's always anxiousness around visa bulletins and HWRA, and I think you should stay informed on this, but don't obsess on it. Control the things that you can control, which is get your NCLEX passed, keep your resume up to date, etc. And maybe keep an eye on this stuff, but don't obsess over it because you can't control it.
Yeah, awesome advice. Chris, thanks again. Ali, thank you. To all of our guests, thank you for joining us. I will mention also that a recording of this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel at Worldwide Health Staff Solutions within the next 24 hours. Please feel free to visit us there and review all or part of the presentation. Please also feel free to share the link to the presentation with any of your friends or colleagues that you think would have an interest or benefit from the topics covered today as well. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Please continue to connect with us through our social media channels. It's the best way of keeping up to date on upcoming webinar presentations. We are committed to bringing topical, relevant information in a timely way. And we look forward to you joining us again soon on an upcoming webinar. For now, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Bye.